Hi, everyone. Last time I talked about a topic that was kind of controversial in some circles. The question I addressed was, did the Red Army actually like any of the tanks that they received during the Second World War as aid, or did they find an excuse to complain about every single one? Well, the answer to that question is, as it often is, it depends on the tank. There were certainly some tanks that were found to be almost completely useless and never even ordered for testing. There were some tanks that were ordered in small numbers, tested, and then turned out to be kind of poor. And then there were those like the Valentine that were tested, found to be perfectly serviceable, and then ordered in great numbers, and they had quite a good reputation, even if by 1944 they were getting quite a bit long in the tooth. My ratings line up pretty well with the number of tanks of each type that were ordered because, well, it turns out that if you like a certain tank, you're going to get order more of it. It just makes sense. In that video, some of you agreed with my ratings, some of you didn't. And as the previous video, this one is probably also going to lead to some heated discussion. I just wanted to remind everyone that the American tanks we're talking about today, are being ranked based on Soviet requirements and Soviet trials. These tanks were tested according to the needs of the Red Army. The evaluation might be different than maybe some other army gave them. That doesn't mean that one or the other is wrong. It just means that different theaters of war come with different requirements. Let's start in chronological order. We're going to begin with the light tank and medium tank M3, both of which the first tanks of that type arrived at the end of 1941, very, very, very tail end. But for various reasons, they did not see service until the spring of 1942. We'll start with the light tank M3, commonly known as Stuart. This is actually an M3A1. The two types were kind of lumped together, so I'm not going to get into great details about which one was better. This was a result of, well, quite a long time American light tank development. This suspension here, you see the vertical volute spring suspension entered development in mid 1930s, I believe. So by the time the Second World War came about, the family of tanks was quite a mature design. The Americans, well, they quite liked this format of tank. The Soviets didn't. It was considered to be too tall. It would flip over easily. The smooth rubber tracks came off very frequently in mud and in snow. They weren't really all that suitable for operations off road on the Eastern Front. Um, this type of tank also consumed high octane gasoline, which in the USSR was largely reserved for aircraft, so they had to wiggle their way out of it using ordinary gasoline with additives. And I mean, the biggest problem with the design is the rivets. The armor plate was joined by rivets rather than welding. The USSR had been welding its tank armor since the mid 1930s, so it was considered fairly archaic. Quality issues didn't help. The first tanks, American tanks that came to the USSR, they had cracks in their armor. They had holes where equipment was supposed to be installed. They were missing things like spare parts and tools. And that's a big part of the reason why these tanks didn't see battle until the spring, even if they arrived in December. So overall, not a fantastic first impression. The Red Army actually considered this tank to be quite poor even for a light tank. So you could give it a pretty low score based on that. It's not surprising that shipments of light tanks M3 began to taper off in 1942 and then ended early in 1943 altogether. The Soviet government chose not to order the tank's successor, the light tank M5. So it seems pretty easy based on that evaluation to put the light tank M3 at the very bottom of the list. But, well, there's two mitigating factors, I would say. One is that the Red Army did consider the light tank M3 to fall short in a number of places, but there's a big asterisk next to that because the tank they were comparing it to was the T-50. The T-50 was possibly the best light tank in the world at that time. Unfortunately, it was produced in very, very small numbers because it was expensive, it was complicated, and for various other reasons. So the Red Army barely had any of them. The most common light tank was first the T-60 and then the T-70, which, well, while a perfectly fine tank on its own merit, is hardly superior to the M3. So with a little bit of hindsight, I think we can maybe scratch that evaluation off the list. The M3 light tank was a perfectly good fine light tank for its time. The other mitigating factor was that the M3 had an almost unique chance to prove itself, because when the Germans broke through near Stalingrad and were getting dangerously close to the Baku oil fields, the Soviets had to usher in whatever armor they had in the region. There was almost no tanks in the south. It was considered a secondary direction. They had a couple dozen of C-26s, and that was about it. Fortunately for the Soviets, what they did have was the Lend-Lease shipping route through Iran with the receiving center in Baku. And it just so happened that a large number of American M3s and Canadian Valentines were coming through Iran around that time. And so, in very many tank units fighting in the Caucasus, you actually had more foreign tanks than Soviet tanks, particularly the light tank M3 and the Valentine 7. So the M3, when you think, okay, light tanks are already kind of becoming obsolete, the M3 got its chance to shine. Despite the drawbacks that the USSR found with the design, they still received 1,237 of these tanks, chiefly in 1942, making it the third most numerous foreign vehicle in Red Army service after the Sherman and the Valentine. Based on that, I think we can give it a respectful B tier. Along with the light tank M3, you had, of course, the medium tank M3. And pretty much every single complaint applied to the heavier brother as well. The quality of the early shipments was not high. Tanks came with missing tools, with missing parts. You actually had an entire shipment of tanks that came without commander's cupolas, with just a big hole in the roof. These tanks required expensive high-octane gasoline to run. The armor was joined with rivets, which was considered to be just an archaic solution by 1942. The tracks were smooth. The suspension didn't really work well on terrain with really big bumps on it. It was very tall, made for a very tempting silhouette for enemy anti-tank gunners. Everybody's already talked about the tank's unconventional three-level armament, but the Soviets found other issues with the design. For example, observation ports. There were lots of observation ports on this tank, but they were positioned very poorly, and the shape of the hull was just so weird that it was really difficult to get good situational awareness. Even though there were a lot of periscopes and episcopes, they really weren't worth all that much. There were also some issues in using the tank as the Soviets liked to use it, because with the 75mm gun being on the bottom and only the 37 being on top, if you dig the tank in, you can't fire the main gun. Not that the Soviets were all that convinced this was the main gun, because initially no armor-piercing ammunition came for them. Only 37mm AP shot was available. Some commanders decided that the 37mm was the tank's primary weapon, and the 75 was only an auxiliary weapon. Now, the record was set straight later on when the correct type of ammunition arrived, but as you can see, the use of early M3 medium tanks was quite harrowing and definitely put a dent in the tank's reputation. Unlike the light tank M3, the medium tank M3 didn't really have a battle where it could prove its worth in a really big, significant way. The tank's reputation was actually so poor that People's Commissar of Tank Production Malyshev requested that no more tanks of this type should be acquired, because, well, it just did not meet standards. Fortunately, the Red Army's Tank Directorate overrode his decision, and these tanks were still ordered. Nevertheless, same with the light tank M3, deliveries tapered off towards the end of 1942, and the last delivery came in January of 1943. The medium tank M3 was kind of a weird vehicle. It wasn't really satisfactory to the Red Army in any way. And I mean, it wasn't really satisfactory to the Americans either. It was always meant to be a transitional product. And, well, because of this, I don't think I can give it any better position than C tier. Now, you're probably going to expect me to jump straight to the medium tank M4, the Sherman, and talk about that. There's definitely plenty to be said, and I did say quite a lot of it. I wrote a whole book on it, as a matter of fact. But I'm going to skip over it a little bit and move forward to later tanks, just so you can kind of understand the difference between Soviet requirements and American requirements, and that what made a good tank for the Americans did not necessarily make a good tank for the Soviets. Interestingly enough, the Americans didn't stop with sending the Shermans to the USSR. They did actually send some tanks from the next generation, namely the T-26E3 Pershing and the M24 Chaffee. Let's start with the Pershing. This was a 40-ton heavy tank, as the Americans classified it, between 1944 and 1946. That's when the classification was canceled. But in 1945, it was a heavy tank. This was the biggest and heaviest tank that the Americans had ever used in battle. A couple of them ended up fighting in Europe before the war ended, so they got a pretty good idea about how useful the tank was in the battlefield, and generally it was very well received. The answer was, yes, give us more of these tanks, and we had a couple of hundred or so arrived in Europe, but didn't have the time to fight because Germany had surrendered. But the Americans quite liked this tank. It was the result of a development program that took about 3 years, so the very peak of American tank engineering thought during the Second World War. The Soviets, on the other hand, were far from satisfied. At 40 tons, this was quite light. You had the IS-2 and IS-3 were hanging around at 45 tons. But at that weight, they had superior protection and superior firepower. The firepower of the Pershing was closer to that of a Soviet medium tank, and its armor was better than the T-34-85, but comparable to the T-44 and T-54. So even though this was the best the Americans could come up with during the Second World War, the Soviets really weren't all that impressed. Since the tank arrived quite so late in the Second World War, there really wasn't a chance that the USSR could have received more of them, even if they wanted to. But I doubt they would have ordered any more. While really the only other comparison here is the Churchill tank, the only other heavy tank received by the Red Army. The Churchill is comparable to the KV-1 when it was received. It had about the same amount of armor, the firepower. Well, the 57mm gun was more optimized for anti-tank work than anti-infantry, but the firepower was still comparable. It was a heavy tank on par with Soviet heavy tanks, and it was treated as such. The Pershing, on the other hand, well, it fell way behind Soviet heavies in firepower, in armor, and it's really hard to see a Pershing being used by Soviet heavy tank breakthrough regiments in the same way that an IS-2 or an ISU-152 would have been. To be fair, the Americans themselves turned out to be quite dissatisfied with the tank and spent half a decade modernizing it, turning it eventually into the M46 Patton, but that's a completely different story. Honestly, I think that even if the Soviets had gotten the Patton in 1945, they might not have liked it very much either. And again, not because it was an objectively bad tank, but that just because that's not what a Soviet heavy tank was supposed to look like. And because of that, I have no choice but to give it quite a low rank. The Pershing ends up in the E tier. The Chaffee tank actually suffered pretty much the same fate. It's really difficult to argue that somehow the Chaffee was not the best light tank at the end of the Second World War. And I mean, these things served into the 90s, so very good design, very long-lasting, one of the all-time best American tank designs. But the Soviets had their own vision for what a light tank was supposed to do. What they wanted was more or less the equivalent of a pre-war infantry tank. This was a tank you could produce in great numbers that could be attached to rifle units and support them in battle. So while the armament, the 75mm gun, was roughly equivalent to the armament of a medium tank, the Soviets would have preferred an 85mm gun, but I think we can let that slide. The requirement for armor required the tank to be able to withstand fire from enemy anti-tank guns, meaning that a Soviet light tank introduced in 1945 would have had to have more armor than a T-34-85, the Soviet medium tank, which sounds absurd, but that's what the Red Army wanted. The Chaffee had about an inch of armor. It was designed to be bulletproof and not resistant to much else because the Americans had a very different vision of what a light tank was supposed to be. And so, again, same with the Pershing. This tank came in very late in the war. There's no chance the Soviets could have ordered any more, but they wouldn't have anyway. That's just not what they wanted to see in a light tank. Uh, Naturally, the requirement was bad. It was not a very realistic scenario to have a light tank with more armor than a medium one. The fact is that such a tank just never came to be. The next light tank and the last light tank to be adopted by the USSR was the PT-76, which was an amphibious light tank, and in many ways, aside from size, of course, close to the Chaffee in terms of firepower and in terms of armor. And even though the American tank was objectively a good tank, and the American understanding of what a light tank needs to do on the battlefield was better than that of the Red Army, nevertheless, by the criteria that I've defined for this video, the Chaffee ends up in the E tier. Alright, now that we've covered the other American tanks, hopefully you're going to understand this section a little bit better. Now we get to, I think, what everybody has been waiting for, the medium tank M4A2 Sherman. The M4A2 came hot on the heels of the medium tank M3, and unfortunately suffered from many of the same problems. The tracks, the running gear were entirely unchanged. Even though the upper hull was welded, the lower hull was still put together with rivets. The suspension didn't improve at all. The tracks didn't improve at all. The shape of the hull, the sides were still very thin, very tall, presented a very tempting target. The gun sights still offered a very kind of poor picture. The part the Soviets liked the least was that there was no markings for high explosive or the machine gun. You just had to use the AP scale and kind of guess where shot with different ballistics would land. Visibility to the sides was very limited. Particularly what the USSR, the Red Army, didn't like about it was there were no longer any backup vision devices to the sides. So remember that early Sherman tanks did not have a vision cupola. You just had the one hatch the commander looked out of. It's often said that the Soviets liked the diesel engine because they liked diesel engines altogether. Well, it's not entirely true. One of the biggest problems with this diesel engine, the Detroit twin diesel, was the injectors. There were early engines had faulty injectors, which reduced the lifespan of the tank engine to single-digit hours, at which point its power would drop drastically and it would no longer be usable. The Soviets weren't making this up or using the tank incorrectly. Somehow the British at around this time had exactly the same complaints. And well, that's on the Americans. That was just a drawback in how the tank was being manufactured. And so when a substitute was available, the Soviets took it. That was the medium tank M4A4, which came with the Chrysler multi-bank engine. The multi-bank engine was also a problematic little gizmo. By little, I mean very big. The tank had to be enlarged to fit it. It became heavier. The engine itself was very complicated because it was essentially 5 engines stuck together. The Soviets really didn't like the added complexity, and they weren't the only ones. The British and Canadians had exactly the same reaction to begin with. The tank did not perform well in trials either. It performed more or less about the same as the M4A2, but with one significant disadvantage: fuel cost. The tank burned a ton of gasoline. It burned about actually more fuel than the KV-1 did in trials. The KV-1, of course, being a heavy tank and the Sherman being a medium. So, I mean, with the M4A2 and the M4A4 performing so badly, well, really, you can only put these tanks in the E tier. Or at least you could have said that if the war ended in 1943. But it didn't. And fortunately for the Sherman, it was not just a lone piece of metal that could be examined in a vacuum. The Sherman was the product of a very large machine. And this very large machine had both its outputs and its inputs. And they received the input from Soviet delegations in the United States that said, hey, your tank kind of sucks. But rather than just complaining about it, they gave the exact specifications. Here's what's happening. Here's, where it's not meeting our requirements. A delegation was sent from the U.S. to the USSR to take a look at how these tanks were arriving, how they were packed, what the condition the parts were in. how they were arriving, how they were being installed, and wrote a very, very lengthy report which went back to the United States, and quality of the Sherman tank improved drastically. Now I can talk about the M4A4 at some length, but that's not really the point of this video. I was serious when I gave it an E tier because only 2 M4A4s were ever ordered. However, when shipments of the M4A2 resumed in 1943, the tanks that were now coming in were of much higher quality. They were much more reliable. They started getting steel tracks with parallel bar grousers, which performed much better in the cold or in the snow, even though they never really quite got to the same level as the T-34. The Americans clearly listened to Soviet complaints and improved their tank to match. And, well, it was noticeable. The difference was noticeable in reports. The Sherman was ordered in huge, huge numbers. Eventually, every single M4A2 tank was going to the USSR. The Americans themselves never really wanted to use M4A2s, and the British had to settle for the M4A4, which actually also improved. The topic of the Sherman deserves its own video and many videos, and I filmed a number of videos about this tank, and I will probably film some more. But this was a tank that truly was on par in terms of effectiveness with the T-34. This wasn't some kind of sideshow in some forgotten part of the front that no one cared about. This tank took part in the Battle of Kursk. It took part in great offenses like Operation Bagration, the Battle of Berlin. Sherman drivers, Sherman commanders received honors up to and including Hero of the Soviet Union. So this tank fought well and, well, fought really, really well throughout the remainder of the Second World War. Now you might say, okay, fine, but so did the Valentine. So what? What makes the Sherman better? Well, one important thing, and something that I alluded to in my previous Tiger video, is reserves. The Valentine really maxed itself out in 1942. You could put a two-person turret on it with a 57mm gun, and, well, it could bore it out for a 75mm, but that's about it. The Sherman continued to improve. It received wet ammo racks, it received a 76mm gun and a new turret, it received a whole new suspension system. Some of these tanks did come in time to fight against the Japanese in 1945, and the Soviets noticed. The new Sherman tanks had much better mobility in mud than earlier Shermans. Their track is twice as wide, so very frequently new Sherman tanks had to pull old ones out of the mud on their way through Manchuria. But I digress. The conclusion to all this rant is that the Sherman, out of all the foreign tanks that went into Red Army service, truly excelled, and I believe it is the only one that is worthy of the S tier. As you can see, the Red Army made a very sober evaluation of any tank offered to them based on their own trials, their own understanding of which characteristics were important and which ones aren't, and, well, their own standards. These standards sometimes didn't agree with the standards of the original manufacturer. Sometimes they did, but sometimes either the Red Army understood what theater of war they were fighting and didn't want tanks that weren't suited to it, or sometimes they went a little bit off the rails and overreached with what they wanted to get out of their tanks. Nevertheless, there were a number of foreign vehicles that the Red Army quite liked, chief of which is, of course, the medium tank M4A2 Sherman.